You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. That's Jesus right there in the Sermon on the Mount, as he really, as we discussed in the last episode of Theologic Sermon on the Mount, part 1, Jesus uplifting these sins, uplifting the standard, uplifting his holiness. So thank you for, if you listened to part 1, thanks for joining Theologic again as we discuss the Sermon on the Mount in part 2. If you are just joining us for some reason because you wanted to skip ahead, go back, listen to part 1. It's pretty informative. So Zach Deacon,
Zach Packey,
Sean Mustian,
Theologic boys talking about the Sermon on the Mount. So let's just start there as we dive into part 2. Thoughts on Jesus's words, harsh words.
Yeah. This goes exactly to what we were saying last time on how important this is and how tied this is to the gospel. Because what he is doing, he's emphasizing for such a long portion of the message, the real nature of sin. We ended last time talking about how in that day there was an outward external observance. They would give lip service and make sure they didn't commit adultery, but you can do anything else in your heart just as long as you're not committing adultery. That's when you're breaking the law. But Jesus is actually bringing the standard to where it was always supposed to be and tied directly to the holiness of God, that sin is a matter not of mere externals, but of the heart. And so he ends that whole, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but he ends that whole chapter with the most unattainable law that you could ever seek to attain, and that is Matthew 5:48. You shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And so he culminates all of those discussions on adultery, you just read, on murder in the heart, on all these other things that are directly related to the Ten Commandments. And he ends that chapter by culminating it and saying, you can't attain it, essentially. You can't do it. You got to be perfect like your Father in heaven's perfect. Anybody who's listening to that in that day and really took in what he was saying, not merely should marvel at him like the people did, but think, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I can't live up to that standard. It's impossible. I can be perfect like God is.
Yeah, I want to almost retract what I said at the beginning. Jesus' words aren't harsh like our cultural calls harsh. They're true, but they're pointed.
Yeah.
And they're sobering.
They're sobering.
Yeah. I want to retract harsh because Jesus isn't being harsh for harsh's sake, but he is. I mean, his words are sobering. I'm just going to read them again. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better. Effectively, it is better to be blind, for it is better for you to lose one of your body parts than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. The implication, sin leads to the wrath of God.
Well, and you find out the dangerous nature of sin. We're eventually going to be talking about an episode on how the gospel gets corrupted in a lot of areas. And one way is when we start looking at sin by saying, well, Jesus will just forgive it. You can indulge in it. But Jesus, he'll just forgive it. You just go to him and he'll forgive you. It's right to say that Jesus and God does forgive our sins. But what Jesus is pointing out here very clearly is the frightening nature of sin to prevent someone from actually being a Christian, or even as being a Christian for that matter. Mm-hmm. When something is offending you to the point where it's actually keeping you from coming to the kingdom of heaven, which is what he's talking about, it's somebody in your life, an influence of sin in your life that is easily pulling you away from God, frightening. He says, cut that off. Get rid of it. For the Christian and the non-Christian. Now, it's different implications for either way, but because there's dangerous consequences that are associated with indulging in sin. I'll give this illustration. If somebody comes up to you and says, even as a Christian, and he says, well, I'm planning on cheating on my wife. What would you say to that person? You would say, number one, you're offending God deeply, but you're also going to ruin the life of your wife. You're going to ruin the life of your kids, and you're going to ruin your own life. Dangerous consequences in this life because of one indulging in sin, let alone the consequences that he brings out that lead to hellfire, for those who would reject it fully and just embrace the externals without ever looking at the heart of the issue.
Yeah.
And those sobering words about sin and the danger of the punishment should not be limited in our thinking only to adultery.
Right.
What we need to understand about Jesus' teaching is he is going through various aspects of the law that was given through Moses. The first two are very clear.
Yeah.
You've got the commandments regarding murder and adultery, but then the other statements that Jesus makes through most of the rest of chapter 5 are coming out of other parts of Leviticus, Deuteronomy. And Jesus is centered on those laws. So as he's going through and giving words of clarification regarding adultery and lust, regarding anger and murder, regarding oaths, etc., the details that go along with each one of those need to be seen in the whole. So when he talks about the danger of ongoing sin in someone's life, undealt with sin, he's not just limiting that to adultery. That's meant, as we read through it, to be read as a unit so that we think about the same implication to our anger / murder, to abuse of oaths, in the same way that his call to extreme rejection of temptation and sin be taken with all of those things. So when you read through these clarification of the commands that Jesus is giving, don't just camp out with anger, murder, or adultery, lust, or oaths. Read the whole of those together. Get the scope of what Jesus is saying about sin, what he's saying about the clarity that he's bringing to these commands. And on that topic of bringing clarity, because that's something that both Packy and Deacon have mentioned, sometimes people will say, well, Jesus is somehow contradicting what Moses had to say. He's contradicting the Old Testament. How do we navigate that? Well, we navigate it by looking at it a little more closely and seeing that Jesus actually isn't contradicting anything. He doesn't, notice something, he doesn't say, it is written, you shall not commit adultery. It is written, you shall not murder. He does not say that. He says, you have heard that it was said. Now, the two examples I just gave, those are written in Scripture. However, if you move on in the sermon and you read, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. And then also, verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. It's that last line, that is not anywhere written.
Right.
What Jesus is doing across this span of text, where he's going through various parts of the Ten Commandments and other parts of Mosaic law, is he is saying, here's what you've been hearing.
Right.
Here's what the Pharisees, the scribes, the priests have been teaching you are the implications of these commands. But I say to you, and then he gives the clear and the true meaning of those commands. So Jesus is not contradicting Moses. He's not contradicting the Old Testament. He is taking false teaching of his day that was loosely based in Old Testament writing, and he's saying, you've heard this, but I say to you, and then he gives the true teaching.
And by way of application, how important is it that we get thoroughly, correctly right exactly what God said, rather than just accept whatever the culture throws our way, then they say it's Christian. Because so often it's really not.
Right.
Some of the best ministries are those whose efforts are there to thwart whatever your cultural Christian idea is, but to give you something that's actually clear, solid, biblical in your understanding.
Yeah. In light of what Sean said, I almost wonder if there was a cultural false teaching at the time that would lead Jesus to say, therefore you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Some type of perfection could have been obtained through just outward observance of the law.
Well, certainly the idea of attaining heaven, right? As long as I'm morally on these, which is why you have throughout the Gospels, you have people coming up and saying, I want to get in heaven. What should I do? What good thing do I need to do to be able to inherit eternal life? There was this idea that in that day, if you're a Jew, if you're a moral Jew, you're going to heaven, things like that. And I think there's actually a belief that Abraham stood at the pit of hell to prevent any Jew from actually going into hell. That was a belief in that day. It's a heavenly perfection, the true holiness of God. And I think that understanding that, I think, vanquishes any false idea in our day even that says that as long as I'm a good person, I'll go to heaven. But no, you have to be a perfect person in order to get to heaven.
That's sobering. We move along. Chapter 6, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Sean, you hinted on it a little bit as we move along. This isn't contradicting anything that we
Right.
read.
Because it's something I would say the reason that it's not contradicting when we read earlier let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. The reason I would argue that these are not contradictory statements is because the whole nature of the sermon that we've already discussed inside and out, that it's about the heart.
Yeah.
This whole thing, Jesus is constantly moving us back to the heart, the motive, what's driving you. He's not so much concerned in the sermon about what you're doing, but why you're doing it, and maybe also to what end you're doing it. So in this one, we compare those verses carefully, which you just read, with what's back in chapter 5, and here it says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them.
Right.
So we want God's glory to be seen, not our own greatness, our own supposed righteousness, but is God.
Contrast that with what when he says that you would be glorifying your Father in heaven to what they had finally received as a reward, right? They wanted to do it for men's praise. They wanted to be exalted by people. And Jesus said, you have your reward. And that was their reward, to be praised by men. But our reward is contrary to that, and that is we want to give glory to our Father in heaven, do what's right so that he gets seen, not me.
Touch on this a little bit. We're going to be doing an episode on prayer coming up. So theologic followers or fans, can we call our people fans? Is that okay?
It's fine.
Yeah, sure we can. If you're fans of our show,
We should ask them. we should ask them what adjective they would prefer to identify with, because I don't want to force any kind of title or identity onto someone that might be listening right now. So Deacon, you might be comfortable offending like that, but our listeners have the right to not be offended.
I'm going to throw up my
An
snack.
adjective instead of a pronoun then, right? Yeah. We choose our own adjectives, not our pronouns, right?
Yeah, it's getting kind of thick in here. So. I'm going to throw up what I just ate. And so touch on theological listeners. We're going to be doing an episode on prayer. So stay tuned for that, but touch on prayer a little bit maybe. I've always taken really comfort in a sense, but I remember this was several years ago when I read through this portion of the Sermon on the Mount, and I read through this. It really gave me what I would feel like is a genuine desire to be alone with the Lord. And so these are Jesus' words. He says, when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, certainly that's not saying Jesus isn't saying don't pray in groups or don't pray outside, but it was very comforting to me that I could indeed lock the door and be with the Lord by myself. And he hears me and he rewards that.
There's a place for public prayer. 1 Timothy 2 talks about that. The men in the church should be lifting up holy hands, offering prayers to God. But what we're talking about here is what is truly genuine about yourself. You have the freedom and you have the impetus to actually go be alone with God, and He will see, and He will reward you not with men's praise, but with an actual answer to your prayer, which implies God's not answering their prayers. He's not interested in saying anything or doing anything regarding what the people on the street corner are doing. He's answering the prayers of those who actually seek Him for what they would need from Him.
And it's something I want to speak into. Again, I know we're going to be talking prayer in a separate episode unto itself, but just in the name of kind of the idea of an overview of this section, because this is very much a section. The continuity of giving, prayer, and fasting is the topic of reward. Are you going to be doing this in such a way as to be rewarded by the recognition of man, or are you doing this for the Lord to receive reward from the Lord Himself? So that's seen throughout, giving, prayer, and fasting. But something that I want to say about this particular topic to us, and I think rightfully so, but a lot of times we express, and I'm not going to say strictly on this podcast, but just in general conversations and circles that we run in, a concern about social gospel, inappropriate social justice that's disconnected from a biblical idea of justice. And this part about giving would probably be a spot where someone that is more in favor of something along the lines of a social gospel or maybe an abuse of the idea of social justice, they might point to this and be like, hey, this is a reason why we are to care for those who are in need. Okay. On the flip side, we are normally going to be looking more at like the prayer and the fasting, like these, what we might call it these really spiritual endeavors. But it begs the question, because I believe that fasting and prayer is of utmost importance in the Christian life, but Jesus seems to be bundling it with the idea of caring for the needy. He doesn't seem to be divorcing. It's not like it's off in the beginning of chapter 5 or it's off in somewhere in chapter 7, but together he talks about giving, prayer, and fasting. And so I think that the question that we each have to wrestle with, not just here as we're recording it, but even you who are listening, do you put the same premium on giving as you do to the ideas of prayer and fasting?
And that's not the same thing as merely giving to your church. Of course, that would be part of it, but giving to those that are in need, giving in a general sense as well.
When you give to those in need, Jesus really doesn't, I don't think he really even qualifies it. He's just saying there's a need. When you're giving to it, what's your motive? Like, I don't even think he really qualifies
generosity. Generosity in living and giving. So
that's just something that jumped out at me as that I'm not saying that I am the perfect giver. That was just more of, as I was looking at the text, like, these are together. Like, I can't just sit here and be like, yeah, I believe in prayer and I believe in fasting, but not say anything to giving to the needy. And
that's a hard thing when you think about in our day and age, in our area, in our era even, just I find it very hard. I'm just going to be honest with our listeners as a pastor. Sometimes you get people that are just coming and they knock on the door of the church or they call the church and they just want a handout. And I don't know them. I'm wondering about their background. I'm wondering what they're going to do with the money that I would give them. If they're going for drugs, if they're going for, am I going to hurt them by actually helping them, by giving to them? That's a hard thing for me to decipher. And knowing, and maybe you guys can help me with it. But
this isn't so much like speaking to that, but I'm going to echo what my parents' pastor once said. This is not on the topic of somebody coming to a church, but the church my parents used to go to, like once a month, they would do a Q&A with their pastor, and somebody asked the question, should I give money to someone on the side of the road that has the homeless sign or anything helps sign? And my parents' pastor paused for a moment, and his answer was, is your hesitancy primarily because you don't know how that money is going to be used, or is that excuse convenient just to keep the $10 in your pocket? And for me, that hit home, because I know 9 times out of 10 when I'm coming up to an intersection in Sioux Falls and I see somebody on the corner with a sign, I'm not challenging your thought there, but just personally, I'm more along the lines of it's an easy out. I'm just going to say, no, it's an easy out. Instead of being like $10, here, or whatever that might look like. But here's the other thing too. If somebody's conscience doesn't let them go there, my boss in South Dakota, he and his family kept bags of like a gallon-sized Ziploc with toothpaste, toothbrush, like maybe like a $10 gift card to Subway, $10 gift card to McDonald's, and other like toiletry items. They kept like 4 or 5 of these bags in their car. And when they'd be going around Sioux Falls and they see somebody, they would step out, give them this bag, talk to them for a little bit, so that you are able to engage them. And if you have an issue of conscience about handing cash, well, your issue of conscience no longer stands. Go get a Ziploc bag, fill it up with toiletries, a couple of gift cards to Subway and McDonald's, and go help the needy.
Yeah, that's
help
good.
the needy.
That's good.
We talk about the G3 a lot.
G3,
the conference. Yeah, sorry.
The G3.
Thanks
I love it.
Yeah. And do you remember when we were in Atlanta the first time? We were approached by a homeless guy in the subway, and
I wasn't there. This was a couple. years ago.
Right. Zach was not there. Yeah, sorry. And so that experience has informed my conscience a lot, and then it's that my response to that gentleman was informed by something that I heard my pastor say in Des Moines, and the church I went to in Des Moines does a phenomenal job of doing the things that we're talking about right now. And so I think at least in at least my conviction on it is both and of what you guys are saying, if that makes sense. So I think that we need to be careful that we're not just saying no because it's awkward, because that's not right. Like if the Lord, I think, has provided you an opportunity to bless somebody in need, I think you ought to do that. And I appreciate your words, Sean. I never thought about how intimately these things might be tied together. Yeah. And that for me is really convicting. The other side of that same point for me would be this gentleman in Atlanta. I don't know if you remember, Sean. We offered, it was kind of a collective effort, to go to Walgreens with him and buy him some groceries, and he refused. Yeah. He didn't want that. And it's like, okay, like that, that's fine. But we're willing to help you. Yeah. Like we're willing to, and that's why, like, your pastor in South Dakota, what a great idea. What a phenomenal idea. Great idea. Here's some tangible things that I know you could probably use. And, whether it's a gift card or I'm going to walk you to Walgreens, Megan and I, my wife's name's Megan. Megan and I have done this for people before. It was a blessing for us to, and our anniversary is coming up here in a couple days, but I want to say this was like maybe 3 years ago. We went and got pho on our anniversary. We love Vietnamese food.
PHO, pho, right?
It's delicious. And so we went and got pho in Sioux City, and there was a lady, homeless lady there, who approached us as we were getting out of our vehicles to walk into the restaurant, who asked us for money. And I said, can I just bring you in and you can have supper with us, and we'll buy you whatever food you want? And she did. And she came inside. It was so cold outside.
Oh, poor gal.
And she was inside sitting at the table with us, talking with us. She didn't talk a lot because maybe it was awkward for her, but we shared the gospel with her. We just blessed her with conversation. Awesome. And she was inside for a couple hours, and she got, I don't know. She got a bowl of soup. She got whatever food she asked for. It doesn't matter. I just said, get whatever you want. Yep. And she did. And she got a couple things, and it was great. That's really sweet. And but like, and so, yeah, let us be people who are open to blessing those who are in need. Yeah. Jesus calls them the poor, so I'll use his verbiage. The poor, while recognizing too that perhaps there is a good strategy to go about doing it. Yeah. Because I know that I have had other experiences in Des Moines. With the individuals that hold signs on the edge of the road and stuff like that, and they just want cash,
right?
And it's like, shoot,
I can't do that.
Yeah, I just I don't feel good about it,
right?
And I'd love to buy you a sandwich or something, but if you're turning down food, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's just
that's good. Those are some really good principles. I like that. Thank you.
Yeah. And so, anyway, we're going to be doing an episode on prayer like we talked about, so I'm just going to jump ahead. I feel like this is maybe a passage that gets twisted, maybe not, or maybe it can turn into a passage that lends towards some legalistic behavior. But, what are you guys' thoughts? Chapter 6, 19 and on. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, but where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So what are treasures in heaven? What?
Well, let's keep tracking through that real quick to verse 24.
Sure.
The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. I read on there because I think that to dialogue over verses 19 to 21, I think that the way Jesus lays these words out, I think we have to get to verse 24 before we do that, because you have this idea of mastery. You can't have two masters.
Yeah,
it'll only be one. It's not like you must have one. You can only have one.
Oh, yeah.
The idea
Amen.
of having two is ridiculous. It's either going to be, in this context, the things of heaven or the things of earth.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, which one is primary? Which one do you see as more with more weight? That does not necessitate that you cannot live wisely and with discernment on this earth,
Right.
but only so long as it is in line with your vision of eternity, with your vision of the heavenly things. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at in verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. Now notice, before he said that, in verse 21, he said, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, I'm ripping off of Paul Washer right here, I'll be honest. I'm ripping off of him.
Do it.
I can't see anybody's heart. I cannot see your heart. I know my heart, and what I know of my own heart is poor.
Yeah.
Because not that I'm poor in heart, but
You should be, right? You're poor in
I
spirit.
should be, but I should be growing in that. But my knowledge of my heart
I know what you're saying.
is poor compared to what God sees. But here Jesus talks about the heart, and then he goes and follows it up with, the eye is the lamp of the body. Well, you want to know what's going on in somebody's heart? Where are they looking? What are they gazing to? What is it that has their attention, has their pursuit? Okay, the heart and the eye are connected.
It's good.
And this is classic Jewish teaching where you pair up two ideas to get across one concept. And yeah, wherever the heart is, the eye's going to be looking. That's where you're going to be. That's what you're going to be pursuing. And I think when he says heart, I don't think it's necessarily only. I think it's part of it, but not only the physical eyeball that's sitting inside of our skull. Although that is a huge indicator, but I do think it's that verbiage, what we're looking to. And then closing off with that, no one serves two masters. You'll either hate one, love the other, be devoted to one, and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And I think that's the idea behind the question you were asking there early about treasures in heaven, treasures on earth, is that's not a command to just live in complete poverty.
Right.
Because think about it this way practically. Going back to what we were just talking about the needy. If you decide to sell everything you have and just live in absolute poverty, how can you help somebody who's in need? Now, again, we don't want to live in luxury. There's a difference between having wealth and using it wisely and righteously and living in luxury. There's a huge difference in that. And I would say that statement, again, based on what we said earlier, that when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we have to have our eyes both on what comes later in the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. So we think about the Proverbs. The Proverbs give wisdom speeches about both generosity as well as forward thinking about the future when it comes to material goods, when it comes to finances. So which is it though that's king? Is it the priority of heaven, or is it the mere shortness of your lifespan and you just having a comfortable and soft life?
One of the things that I've learned as I'm a pastor is part of your role, your goal, your purpose is to give people an insight, a hope to point them to that which is eternal after this life. And as much as you deal with the things in this life, we must have an eternal perspective. And one of the things you note about so many false teachings out there is they have no eternal perspective. Like I said, the prosperity gospel, it's merely earthly, for example. All you have is an understanding of things on this earth, not much thought about heaven, not much thought about that which is beyond. And part of the role is to teach people this is what it's going to be like afterwards. Set your heart on that. So when I got done preaching yesterday, Christian, you might as well, if God is working on your heart to obey Him in a clear biblical way, you might as well give in to Him now to do that, because when you're in eternity, you're going to have no impulse at all to rebel against Him than you would here and now. Our job on this earth is to live in heavenly mindset, looking toward what is in eternity, and let that influence what we are to be now. Why should you live apart from sin? Because Christ has done away with sin. Reckon yourself already dead to yourself, because you're already in Christ, eternally promised these things. So, here, what do we see? The as we're thinking about the Sermon on the Mount being the foundation for so much teaching in the New Testament, here you see the beginnings of the fleshing out of what our eternal value should be.
Well, here's what I want to do. We're coming to the close of our episode on part 2. By the way, if you guys haven't read the Sermon on the Mount in a while, which motivated me to use this as an episode topic, please do. I mean, just it's wonderful. It's obviously God's word, But it is. It's the entrance into not only the Gospel of Matthew, but Jesus' teaching in everything else. And so I'm staring at a book by Martin Lloyd-Jones. He wrote an entire book.
Preached an entire sermon series that got put into book.
Oh, okay, that's what it is.
Martin Lloyd-Jones never wrote a book.
He didn't?
He just got it
okay.
transcribed. It was always
Really?
his sermons were transcribed into.
Oh,
Yo.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I wonder if you can go on maybe as a way of referring somebody to a resource. The book would be Studies in the Sermon on the Mount by D. Martin Lloyd-Jones. But there's also, I believe, you'll have to look on mljtrust.org, MLJ, Martin Lloyd-Jones, trust.org, and they have a whole slew of his sermons that are on there.
Audio.
His audio sermons
Really?
from when he preached back in like the 50s and 60s and all that, and it goes into you'll have to look into it yourself, listener, to see if the Sermon on the Mount is on there. But you can find so much from him on that.
You can search by Bible text. So
Yeah.
you can look by Matthew and look to Matthew chapter 5. You can search through by scripture text.
When we were at G3 last time, they actually gave me a USB drive
Yeah.
of all of his sermons. I haven't
Really?
looked at it yet, but yeah, because you can get it online.
Oh, wow.
All of the
Cool.
sermons I think that they have on mljtrust.org. So.
Cool.
Yeah,
Well,
folks, let me just say this real quick, because maybe some have never heard of Martin Lloyd-Jones. I'm just going to say hypothetically, maybe there's some listening that have never heard of him. I want to encourage you for this to be a name that you get familiar with.
Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a producer that did a Christian documentary on his life, and this was the driving point of going for Lloyd-Jones.
Yeah.
He surveyed the leading preachers of our day. When you think YouTube preacher, whoever that is, for you, most likely whoever that is for you.
Stephen Furtick.
But this
No.
was no. But I mean, these were guys like John MacArthur, John Piper.
Right.
This is R.C. Sproul. These were faculty from the
Yeah.
leading seminaries across our country. This was David Platt. This was Kevin DeYoung. Help me out with some other names. Vodi Bakum, Steve Lawson.
Steve Lawson.
And this guy went around and asked him, like, who are your influential preachers that you've listened to? And the common denominator was Martin Lloyd-Jones.
Yep.
He had a fundamental influence on the 20th century. So I would encourage you that if you've never heard of Martin Lloyd-Jones, make this a year that you get familiar with him. He's got some phenomenal work out there, both in audio and in writing. Well, he preached it, but somebody else wrote it.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about his book, so thank you for telling me that.
And the documentary Sean's referring to is called Logic on Fire.
Oh, yeah.
So go look that one up too. It's on. You can probably find it on. I don't know if it's on Netflix, but I think you can see it on Amazon. Maybe rent it at that point. But that's a really good one.
Well, we're going to wrap up here just with one more. May this be an opportunity for you guys to present the gospel, I guess. I'm just throwing that out on the tee. I'm looking at a book on the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, this thing, it's a decently thick book, right?
Yeah.
And so, guys, we've dipped our toe in what is
Maybe our toenail even.
Yeah, just the swath of truth. And we haven't even gotten into the really that much depth in what Jesus is saying on the Sermon on the Mount. My point in saying all that is go back and read it, study it, because we haven't covered it in enough depth in 2 half-hour episodes. But I'll close with this. This is Jesus' words in chapter 7. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter through it, for the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it.
Yeah. The gate is Christ, His righteousness, His truth, what He teaches, and the way that's broad. That's every other religion, and that's every other even Christian-esque religion. So,
John?
I just want to echo what Deacon said to meditate on this passage. I know I just kind of sang the praises of Lloyd-Jones, but at the same time, though, with equal sincerity, I say just pick up Matthew 5 and begin to read through it. And I wouldn't say get caught up in each verse, but read 5, 6, 7, and then start again. To quote Lloyd-Jones, he said that one of our dangers sometimes in our Bible reading is we miss the forest for the trees. So before we start asking pointed and detailed questions about like 2 verses, make sure you're reading through the whole sermon. You're getting the feel of it. You're getting the flow of it. You're seeing where Jesus is starting and where He's leading and where He's ending. Just take time to soak in, marinate in the Sermon on the Mount. Read through it. Don't be in a hurry. This is not about learning per se as much as it is about knowing the Lord, knowing His Word, knowing His will for your life. So just take time, and that for me, that's personally, one thing I'm very grateful for with Deacon leading us in this direction to go through the Sermon on the Mount is it gave me a tangible reason to sit down with my Bible and my journal and a pencil and just read through it. I didn't really even touch an external book. It was really just reading through the sermon and just enjoying it, taking down notes, praying as the Spirit led me. And so, just go read it.
We'll close with this, the words of God. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. That's the close of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Thanks for listening to another episode of Theologic. Check us out on the next one.